But thank you very much for coming. I'm going to start with a short story. I found myself staring at my code editor. I needed to alter the application to add role logic, a requirement that didn't exist before. That meant the content displayed would be impacted multiple places across the app. I also needed to pass this new state around and was fighting the application re-rendering since data was coming in from a few different places, AJAX requests and WebSockets. I eventually introduced the feature, but I didn't feel I had won anything. It took longer than expected, and I knew I'd forget it again, since I only work on this application every few months. I'm not sure if that resonates with anybody else, but that's me, baby. But before I get into who me is, I do want to pitch something, because I have the stage. I'm the president of Cleveland Give Camp. It's an annual event. You can think of it as like a hackathon for charity, right? So we bring together tech people who are interested in volunteering their time for local nonprofits in the Northeast Ohio area. And it's going to run from July 26th to the 28th. So it's a Friday afternoon to Sunday afternoon. We feed you every meal, and you work on projects that have a big impact for local nonprofits. So we work with those nonprofits in advance. We prep them with project managers. We break down their stuff. And then we hit the weekend, and we work really hard. I like to think of it as like condensed volunteerism, right? You can kind of like get it all out in one weekend. And the really great thing about it is that we have a very strict, you are not attached to this project policy, which means that you can help people without being called on a weekend later to like fix their printer or do something like that, right? We typically make a lot of websites for people, but we've done like reporting applications and kind of married data from different places. We've migrated them off of expensive hosting providers to cheaper ones, really helping these nonprofits who don't do tech get their tech goals accomplished for free, right? And so if that seems interesting to you, please check out the website. Please talk to me afterward. It's a really amazing experience, and we've been doing it for about 13 or so years now. So check it out. They do have a couple of these in other scattered places across the US, so if you're not from the Northeast Ohio area, I would at least check out the concept of it. Okay, back to me though. So my name is John Knapp. I'm an independent consultant, contractor. I do development work. I've been doing it since 2006, so quite a while. And that kind of longevity and an opportunity to jump into all of these different projects for different customers has really given me the privilege of looking back at history and trying to figure out, was there room for improvement, right? Did we potentially overcomplicate some of these scenarios that went into different customers' applications, right? Sometimes I build stuff from scratch. Sometimes I am gifted things that I need to work within or to fix or replace. And so I think it's given me a good viewpoint, right? I'm not tied to an individual company. I'm not tied to an individual language or code base or application or something like that. And so I think it's given me some good perspective. And when I do projects for people, I always want to provide value, right? If I'm not providing value to the company, which is typically in a rough way, they make more money than I take away from them, then I'm going to be fired, right? And I definitely wouldn't have been around since 2006. So it's very, very, very important to me to not just listen and say yes, but to actually provide end results that are acceptable to the customer and beyond exception, right? And so when you do that, you also have to make sure that your long-term in these projects is reasonably painless, because I will work on things, and then I will be told to go away, and then I will be asked to come back, and some amount of time has passed. And sometimes those projects go to a company where maybe they have development teams and people can kind of keep it up to date and maintained, but sometimes they just sit there in hibernation, right? The application runs, but the code base has become locked in time. And I don't know if you've ever had to deal with one of those projects. I'm sure a lot of you have, but it's kind of not fun sometimes to come back into it and be introduced to all of the breaking changes, the libraries that won't install anymore, right? And so a third goal that I've kind of added into all my projects implicitly, just the way that I work, is when possible, reduce the amount of code that is needed to run the application. And that's not my code, right? It's not the application code itself. That's like every library. That's every service. That's every like thing that you depend on to ship your application to production, right? Every single piece could disappear, change their open source license, or like be replaced or break, or like it's all a liability. Everything is a liability, right? And so the best thing that you can do is not write anything at all, okay? And so we're going to try to get back to that in this talk and think about maybe some of the approaches that can make our work environments a little bit faster. I had a friend who pitched the concept of complexity budget to me one time, and he said, he was a freelancer as well, and he said, I don't take on projects where I have to learn more than one new thing at a time, right? I'm not going to take on a project that needs to learn, I need a new ORM system, or I need a new language, or I need a new library or something, right? He's like, I can take in a little bit more than that, right? I can learn. I'm not incompetent. I can educate myself on these topics, but I don't want to burden the already difficult process of listening to requirements and turning it into value and make that more complex than it has to be. And I think that has kind of always stuck with me, right? Because our jobs are complex. We do a lot of things, right? There's so much involved with getting HTML to show up in somebody's browser. Why would you ever burden it with more complexity? I mean, unless you're a better consultant than I and you want to make a lot of money and stuff like that, right? But if there's any like company people here or project managers or anybody who's trying to like actually get things out the door and make people happy, right? Like, why would you ever complicate these things? And to be fair, I think developers want this as well, right? I don't know many people who are like, I really love my job because they'll never fire me. Like, I just get to work on this cruddy application all the time, and nobody knows how it works, and I don't either, right? Like, we don't want that. That's not why you're here, learning new things. And so my big point that I want to make is that my bold stance is, I think we have made our jobs harder than necessary, okay? And I'm going to break this down in 3 different parts. But I think we do this for a few different reasons. There's this kind of like allure of the unknown, right? I put HTML in my talk title. Like, I don't know what thank you for the glaring lights in my face, because I can't tell how many people are actually in this room or in any other subsequent rooms and stuff, but I don't know if HTML is like a sexy thing to go watch right now, right? Like, it's not really a thing to go, I want that thing that people talked about a lot, maybe a decade ago when it hit HTML5 and then like was introduced a couple decades before that, right? Like, so we want to like learn these new things, we want to iterate and we want to evolve, and I do think that there's also like, we're always constantly asking ourselves, like, is this it, right? Like, is the project that I'm in, is the way that we handle these problems, is that like good? Can it be improved upon? Can we like lower our stress and the amount of time that is needed to work on these things? And like, it's always this kind of like comparing a thing that you don't have because you don't know how complex that is or where it'll go. And it always looks better than where you're at right now, right? New is cool as well. Newer has to mean better, right? It's got to be. Like, why else would somebody make a new library if it's not better than the ones that were there before it? And developer advocate is like a job title. Maybe some of you have this job title. It's not a bad job title, right? Like, it's your job to talk about tech or to talk about a service or to talk about a thing, right? It's typically newer. You're trying to educate people on it. You're becoming like an influencer on pushing content related to this topic because you want adoption, right? Again, who's like a tech advocate for HTML? Like, I mean, I want like a shirt that says like, I'm with HTML or something like that, like, right? Like, but I don't really want that shirt because it's silly. Like, it's this like bedrock that is implicit in every single thing that we do, but you don't have like, there's no rah. And I think there's, I'm not knocking anything that is in place today or that people are working with their applications because, things progress for a reason, right? There's a thing and there's problems that are introduced and then you find some interesting solutions and so you move further and you move further and you move further ahead, right? And there's not anything wrong with that. But I just want you to kind of contemplate if like we stopped and asked ourselves, do we need everything that is involved with this application, right? And it's no longer this sense of the world is moving forward. It's the world is completely different. If we looked at ourselves through the lens of B, where we were at with technology, and we said, the landscape is completely different. Like, we now have far fewer browsers for the pros and cons that provides to us, but a lot more standardization on what is available, a lot more functionality that is available to us and stuff. Would we still have made the same decisions to go to C to D, or could we possibly just skip ahead a couple steps, right? And I think this is an incredibly important thing because I can't tell you how to do this. This is a thing that I need you to just have in the back of your brain. But I think really, like, one of the biggest reasons that we kind of move to new things constantly is because, at least this rings true for myself, and I think we have an industry that is fraught with imposter syndrome, but we don't want to look stupid, right? Like, to question something kind of implicitly infers that, like, you may be seen as, like, not intelligent enough to understand it. Or you at least maybe have that nagging voice in the back of your head, even if it's not true at all, right? And so I just want to say that, like, we're all here together. We can all do better than where we were, and I want you to kind of find your ways past this. So my presentation goals today are rethink how we build modern web applications, reduce the number of dependencies and the technical knowledge that are needed, help development and releases get out faster, and understand that code is a liability. So this is a picture of a silver bullet, which is super corny, but I just want to do this. I want to be like, hey, asterisks, like, obviously, everything that I talk about, you could find examples where it's not going to be helpful, or where it's actually a negative to what you're trying to do. Please don't let those things stop you from listening to the rest of the content, right? Feel free to kick that nagging voice over to the side and just say, yes, great, John, that's fun, but you know, it won't work for us because of X, Y, Z, right? Or it won't work in project ABC, right? It won't work in project Acme over here, but maybe it'll work over here, right? And just one last thing before I leave. I thought it was kind of ironic when I was looking for a picture of a silver bullet, dropped on Wikipedia, and they leave a quote here that says, the effectiveness of real silver bullets compared to lead ones is not entirely known, which I thought was funny because, you know, yeah. So many people laughed. So many people laughed. So how do we do better? Well, I broke it into 3 parts: shared knowledge, starting simple, and using technologies that support our goal. So, what is shared knowledge, or what am I trying to get across? I want you, everybody here probably is very educated in a lot of different things, a lot of different technologies, different languages, right? And I want you to put all of that off to the side, right? We're not here to fight about Ruby being a dead language. It's not. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. If you just think about your application as a black box, right? The clients make requests to, and receive responses from. This is where I want your mindset to be. It doesn't matter what happens in that black box, right? That black box is complex by itself, right? But it doesn't have to be. It could be static pages for all I care. I don't know what database is there. I don't know what language is there. I don't know what libraries are used. I don't care as a consumer, right? I want the end result. I want to make the requests. I want to get the response. I want to see it on my page, right? I don't want to make the request to JSON. I don't want to look at JSON, unless you're building a JSON viewer, I guess. I just want the application to do what I want it to do, right? And I think if you think about your application as a black box, then it allows your company to do a lot more with that, right? You can replace things behind the scenes. You can make improvements. You can swap out parts entirely, right? Because the end result is that the requests come in and the responses come back, right? And that's extremely powerful. So if we looked at an example of a web page, this is kind of like another black box, right? I don't care, kind of, how this thing came to be, right? It's got a lot of stuff that I can interact with. This is my gateway to the internet. There's a reason that this page exists or this application exists. There's functionality that I'm, like, responsibilities that I'm trying to like perform and stuff like that. And so if we look at it as another black box, what is this page made of? Right? If I viewed the source, what am I going to find? Well, if we looked at it through a lens of shared knowledge, we would maybe be able to find the same things, right? If I look at these navigation links over on the left-hand side, and I polled the audience secretly, what are these things made out of, right? What is backing it? If we come up with the same solution, then that's shared knowledge, right? That's not a thing that you now have to like learn because you changed your JavaScript library or the language that you're working in, right? Maybe there's some complexity in how to render those pages and the templating logic and all of it tied into everything else on the back end, but just get rid of that, right? Because we're just here in the client and we're trying to figure out, how do I not have to relearn the world when I want to build another web application? And I think if you can focus on making reusable things, using things that exist already, right? Tabular data, links, and then a whole bunch of stuff that falls down that we'll talk about later. And that's empowered because of standards, right? Is the video going to play? Oh, yeah. Look at this. That's me scrolling through the HTML spec, just the table of contents. Isn't that fun? Who's really excited right now? See? There we go. Yeah. I mean that, but I don't mean that, right? Like, I mean common knowledge, right? Which is backed by standards. That's great. I love it. It exists in our HTTP requests and how those responses come back, and our HTML and our CSS, and JavaScript has a standard library and stuff. They all have standards around them, and I think that's incredibly important. But I don't want you to get hung up on spec says A, blah, 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 explicitly blah, right? We're trying to like do better, do faster. So standards provide us a common understanding, and they insist in migrating between languages and libraries, and they give you additional functionality for free. If you put a link on a page, an anchor tag, you can control-click that anchor tag, and it'll open a link in a new browser. If you put a div on a page, and you put an on-click handler on it, and you right-click that element, it doesn't do that. Why? Like, why do we do this to ourselves, right? Like, there's a reason that this stuff exists. You can copy and paste a table and drop it into an Excel, right? There are like niceties that you get. There's accessibility and screen reader support, things that you get automatically by just spending a little bit of time to do the underlying framework of your application a little bit better. Like you said, how do you go to another page? Well, you use an A tag. If you aren't using an A tag right now, I want you to leave this talk. No, actually, I don't want you to leave this talk. This talk is for you. You should learn this. You should learn this stuff, because I really get perturbed by something else stepping in the way of everything that we have built, because you know what typically happens is that they don't reinvent it all. They don't magically add back accessibility or these extra browser features that you kind of get by default, because their job is just to implement some feature and get it out the door. Looks good, works on my machine, done, right? They cut it short. How do you render a table? A table. How do you know if an HTTP request succeeds? Well, we have status codes, right? 200 and 300s. How does it fail? 400s and 500s, right? This is hopefully common stuff. If it's not, this is definitely something that you should understand if you're doing web development. How do you ask for a response in a specific format? Well, you can send an accept header. How do you know what you got back? You can get a content type header. How do you signify that you want to view a URL? Well, you can make GET requests. You can make POST requests to signify that you want to change data. And I don't want anybody to like stop and raise their hand and say, well, actually the spec says in this. That's not where we want to go with this conversation, right? We're trying to like steer back a ship that has been headed in potentially a different direction for quite a bit, and may have been going a little faster than it should have. But the fun thing about specs is that they also change, right? Again, I don't know who's like going and reading up on new HTML elements. I say that kind of jokingly because I definitely don't do it all the time, but there's like new stuff there too, right? There's like things that pop up. Like you can do modals inside of it now, just by default, right? You can also do soon popovers, right? Tooltips and stuff like that, just by toggling an element on or an attribute on an HTML element. So again, this shared knowledge, familiarity, there's lots of documentation, right? There's all this content that already exists. But I really want to like stress here that like part of this is your responsibility, right? You need to stay up to date, not like cutting edge. That's okay, but just like make sure that you just refresh yourself every once in a while, so that you could potentially find some ways to cut out maybe the extra stuff that is needed to make your application run, because you get more of that functionality baked in for free. So, second part, I want you to seek simplicity. So what is simple? Well, I think HTML is pretty simple. In fact, when I talked about writing HTML, people like would make fun of it a little bit. It's not really programming language. And it's like, I don't care. Like, I'm not really sure where this conversation is going, right? I'm not trying to like show how intelligent I am by the language that I use, right? There's a concept of progressive enhancement, a term meaning you write something where it can be accepted by as many clients as possible, and then you add functionality for the clients that can kind of like move it further, right? And I'm not here to like be a staunch progressive enhancement advocate. I do not understand how you would make modern websites today without JavaScript in some form, right? I'm not trying to say remove technologies that aren't necessary, but I do think that this concept is incredibly important, where it is, how do I build something that accomplishes the goals, and then how, if I need to, improve that experience for different clients and customers and stuff like that. There's this horrible acronym called HATIOS, which is hypertext as the engine of application state. When I say HTML is simple, it's because it encapsulates everything that you need to do, right? This example of a bank account shows us the actions that we can take, right? It's there in the response that we receive from the server. I know the state of my account. I know the actions that I can take because the actions are there on the page, right? If I have a negative balance, I could return different actions. I could return different content to the user, right? It includes everything that you need to view the experience, interact with the experience. So what else is simple? Server rendering. Remember this, when we like did this stuff? Where you like have different URLs, and you could respond to those URLs and send content back? It was great, wasn't it? This is REST, right? This like shared understanding of being able to make a request for content, receive information back, be able to push changes out to the server, be able to hear kind of how the server interacts with that. It splits up the complexity, right? You have these different siloed places where these different pieces of functionality are going to occur. You know where you will talk about a collection of items. You know where you will talk about an individual item. You know where you will update and change and delete that, right? And I understand that things are more complex than this, right? But I think this being a backbone, a place where you start, is an incredibly conscious, like it's a thing that you should strive for. But then we wanted to make stuff more complicated, right? And so now I'm just going to use data tables as an example. It's a library, right, where you take your content and you provide these other places where interaction can occur. Because, I mean, to be frank, this is how you want to interact with it, right? You're not looking for huge page reloads and content to come back. And like, you want to be able to kind of type, see results change as you go, pagination updates, you can filter, you can sort, all of this kind of stuff, right? These are commonplace. We expect this stuff. So we're like, okay, what do? We have this like old crufty HTML rendering stuff, but we want to do more new fancy things, right? And we started to build more and more functionality in the JavaScript ecosystem. And we pushed it to a point where we make a lot of these single-page applications, right? You're not making all of these individual server responses coming back anymore. You're changing that. You've now introduced a concept of the client having the logic and understanding to know what requests it's going to make, take data back in the form of typically JSON, which you could do over JSON endpoints, you could do it over GraphQL, however you want to do it. But the end result that needs to be displayed isn't JSON, right? That's not what we're displaying to people. And so we need to now have the logic to take that in and turn that JSON into a bunch of HTML that then gets turned into the page that we're trying to show, right? And we did this for a reason. I mean, like, we didn't just magically show up here. Like, things could get complicated in server-rendered land and having your logic kind of spread off in different places. And so this kind of allure of having an API that only responds to JSON content, and I could maybe use it a couple places in different applications and stuff like that, like, it made sense, right? Okay, this is a safe space. I just want to see, real quick, does everyone think that your lives are better now? Like, you don't have to respond. I question it sometimes. I don't think it's bad. I think all of this stuff is great. I'm glad it exists, and I'll use it when I need it. But I think we have to get out of the mindset of, like, we have a new default, right? Our default is in this other place that has a lot less strings attached that just works consistently all the time, right? And there's no magical, like, compile step that needs to kind of take your code and turn it into something else, right? We got complicated on the front end to ourselves. We did it to ourselves, right? And it's not to say, again, like, some people need this, right? Maybe you have, like, a separation of your front-end team and your back-end teams, and they're working on different things, and you have multiple clients and all the, like, complexity that needs to occur for your application to serve all of the clientele that is working with it. If you do not, please don't do this to yourself until you need to do it to yourself, right? Because there's a whole bunch of, like, meme-y stuff that we can talk about for JavaScript, right? But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. What matters is, are you able to be productive in the environment that you have created for yourself? Or does it maybe take a little bit longer? Because now you have to go add these endpoints that work differently, and now you have to go update all of the recipients of that information, and maybe that's a native application over here and an HTML, web responses to your web application over here. It just gets complicated, right? We duplicate logic that already exists on our server, right? Why? Maybe it's something you need to do, but maybe you don't need to. So seek simplicity, okay? Again, this is a starts with you thing, right? I'm going to talk to you right now, and then I'm going to be done talking, and then that's it, right? So I need you to hopefully remember some of this stuff or have my nagging voice in the back of your head. And maybe you're not as big of an organization as the organization's pushing some of this stuff, right? This definitely rings true on the infrastructure side as well, but that's a different talk. So just remember who you are and what you're building and where you're trying to go. And also remember, you're going to hate whatever you write. Like, I've never done anything that I loved 6 months to a year later. I would always, like, because the requirements change. Your perspective on the problems changed, right? You had to make assumptions to move the project forward, and some of those will hit, and some of those will not, right? And so you will always look back with a sense of, like, if I could do this again, or this part again, I would approach it differently, right? We now know that we have these performance bottlenecks, and so I would have split my data like this. I would have, changed the interface to be able to, empower these flows, which is where our users ended up going and stuff, right? So don't feel like you have to front load all of that into something more complex. Okay, so supportive technologies. I'm just going to list a few of them here because I think this group, htmx, Hotwire, /turbo, /stimulus, and unpoly, really have a different approach to improving the interface or your user's experience with your pages. Instead of owning the world, which is not necessarily what React's original intent was, but what we have built with it does own the world, you supplement the world, right? You still depend upon HTML that your servers send back, and then you figure out intelligently what you want to do with it. So htmx, you'll see a couple examples from htmx and Hotwire. I didn't put unpoly examples in there, but it's been around like since 2015 or something like that for quite a while. So if this concept is interesting, I would at least look at what some of these options are. So htmx is going to give you, modern stuff, right? You're going to be able to make AJAX requests and CSS transitions and WebSockets and server-side events and stuff like that. And it's going to do it with, you'll see, basically supplementing the attributes on DOM elements. I don't love this personally, but this is a thing that they do, and some people really like it. I'm more of a Rails Ruby developer, and so I'm over in this land of Hotwire, which, again, is just focusing on primarily pushing HTML and then giving you supportive technologies to do stuff with that, right? And so Hotwire, they made overly complex by being this like blanket word over the products of Turbo, Stimulus, and Strata. I'm not going to talk about Strata, but Strata would be like pushing HTML and then using that to build native applications, right? So if this concept seems interesting to you for web servers, you can do this stuff inside of Android and iOS applications as well. So let's go back in time a little bit to 2013, where this is at least in the Rails documentation where they started to talk about like making AJAX responses or responding to things differently, right? And so we kind of have this respond block. So if somebody makes a request to this action, I can respond with HTML, but I could also respond with some kind of thing to the JavaScript side, right? And this was what their documentation had before, or in this Rails or version 4, is render your partial on the server. There's some like magic-y stuff that like you'd have to be a Rails developer to kind of understand, but you're rendering a partial, you're encoding that as HTML, you're sending back a big string to the JSON response that is then getting passed. At that point in time, jQuery was super popular and stuff still. Passing it to jQuery, and you're swapping the content in, right? So you made a request to the server for a thing, and it's sending you back what that rendered partial would look like, and it gets swapped into the page, right? And I remember doing this, and then I remember being like, this is crazy, right? Because this code got way more complex and stuff like that. And then I went, I don't know, maybe this JSON API thing is a good idea, right? Well, time marches on, right? Between 2013 and 2020, a lot of time has passed. A lot of applications have been built. A lot of things have been reconsidered, potentially, right? And so here is where we come up with the branding of Hotwire and the re-release of Turbo, which used to be called Turbo Links. And this concept in htmx hits 1.0. And the whole concept is push the HTML over the wire, right? However you're making these requests, WebSockets, HTTP requests, form responses, push HTML, right? If your only consumer takes HTML, push HTML. Why are you pushing anything else? Why are you putting something else in the middle of that thing, right? But then you do stuff with that HTML. You swap it into the page automatically, right? No like flash of a new page. You're making these requests behind the scenes. You could do partial page updates. You could lazy load your content. All of this stuff gets faster as you do like normal web stuff, like put caching in front of it, right? Like everything gets faster and better. So background page loads, one of these pieces of functionality is when you click links or submit forms, instead of just like, the page goes to white and you see the little loading indicator and you end up on the new page. What if you just did all of that on the side, right? You made that as like an AJAX request. And then it listened to whether it was successful or failed, and then it knew what to do with the response. which if we're just thinking about this as a very basic, no complex, RESTful routes, multi-page application like we originally started with. All good, I've done that. If you've done that, you could just swap that new content in, right? The intent is to end up on the new page. You could swap that in automatically, and then it feels more modern, right? You're not actually making JSON requests and stuff like that. You're making HTTP requests. You're swapping the content in. In some cases, it could be even faster, right? Because you're not doing the compilation of JSON into HTML elements into the render it into the browser. So in Hotwire, you just get this for free, right? And this is very easy to introduce into a new application and something that you might have to fight with if you introduce it in an old application. Probably, so just kind of keep that in mind. If you're going to be integrating it into an older application, I would instead use some of the data attributes that they have to toggle everything, all of the magic stuff off, and then you use it where you want it. So you just include this on the page and you get these magical like AJAX page requests, AJAX responses to form requests. If you hit the back button, it's instant because it keeps a local cache and it utilizes the browser's history object that you can interact with the JavaScript to take you right back to the snapshot of HTML that you had before, right? And so you get kind of all these things for free. htmx, a little bit different. They want you to kind of opt into it. One thing that I did want to call out, because we were on the topic of complexity, do you know there's like a whole bunch of ways that you can bring JavaScript into your application now? There's these like JavaScript modules where you could do stuff like this, where it will actually just bring in content from a URL, right? That could be your own personal URLs serving from your server and stuff like that, or that could be like library URLs. And there are also like services like Unpackage that'll take all of these node modules and help break them up so that you can bring that stuff in as individual parts and pieces and use them, just in case you were looking to reduce the complexity of your dependency management, or not necessarily dependency, well, kind of dependency management and like smashing all that stuff together to figure out what you're going to work with. So if you look back at our old web page example, if you just made these background requests, the whole page gets swapped in, right? If I click a different link, this whole thing swaps in. And it just happens magically, because if you went to these individual pages, you would also be rendering the content for that page, and it just happens. But maybe you want to like improve it a little bit and maybe do partial HTML updates, right? So this would probably be mostly in response to like form submissions and stuff like that, but there's nothing that would stop you from, well, I'll get to an example in just a sec, but utilizing something like this in Hotwire, which is saying basically, I want this section of the page to act like it was, for lack of a better word, an iframe, right? I want links that you click to change the content that's inside of the frame. I want the form submissions to end up with content changed inside of this frame. And you can have some different attributes to add to break out of the frame if you want to, but you're kind of like taking these larger HTML responses and finding the piece of content that you need and swapping it in place. And then if you said, well, I don't want to take the whole page for whatever reason. I don't want to send the full HTML response back. I want to send back the parts and pieces that I need. You could look at turbo streams instead, which is saying, here is a chunk of content that I want you to do something with. And they're very basic actions on purpose. There's things like replace, append, prepend, stuff like that. And you take these kind of like HTML that you would respond with, wrap it in some template tags, and you can send those back. And you can send back multiple if you want. And you can also take these things and send them over WebSockets, right? So that when something happens on the server that you want somebody's messages list to be able to have this new message prepended to it, you could send this same payload back. In htmx, they do it a little bit differently. I actually kind of like the simplicity of this. There's no frames. There's no like magic stuff. It's kind of a couple attributes on here to say, here's where you make your request. Here's where you find the content in the request that I want you to work with. And here's where you put it in the target. So if you look back now, you could turn this whole table into piece of content that swaps in response to the queries that you make to the server, right? When you start searching or when you sort or when you change pagination, those are just query parameters, right? You're already able to handle this stuff in your multi-page application. It responds back with the content that you need, and it just swaps in the piece that you're in, right? So if we had like an interactive form down here below, and we started to type into it, but we wanted to like update the table results up top, or maybe you're working inside of a form and you want to dynamically load a list of drop-down options, you're just making requests back to the server, having it return HTML that you need, and you swap it into the content, right? And you're only swapping the pieces that you're looking for instead of the whole page, so you don't lose form progress and stuff. And you could also do that down below too, right? Maybe each one of these tabs loads content that's a little bit more intensive. Comments would be probably a good example, right? If you're not going to render that stuff on the page immediately, but you would want to render it for somebody who requests it, what you can do is you can say, I want to lazy load content into this comments tab when it shows up on the page, right? And so if somebody clicks on comments, it would have a very little amount of JavaScript that would toggle like visible or take the, change the display on the HTML element on the page that is just a turbo link with like a URL and an attribute of like lazy or something like that. And then you bring the content in as it's needed. But we pushed it a little bit further, and the latest version that's coming out actually is a bit of a return to simple. So I mentioned that you could like do these partial requests and send that stuff back, but you know what? That like, remember, we're trying to reduce complexity. There may be needs for that. It's great that those tools exist, but what if we could just like not think about stuff even more, right? React has already proved that you can do virtual DOM diffing in a client fast enough that it's like an enjoyable experience, right? So if you leverage a library that does DOM diffing, you could send back the full page response again, and you could swap that, morph that stuff into the page that you already have, and retain scroll position, retain form field, values and stuff like that. So leverage the things that we already have without introducing complexity on your server responses. And to do some of this DOM stuff, one of the drawbacks to trying to send HTML over WebSockets is that the WebSocket payload is only so large, right? And so there's a point in time where it becomes unusable for certain tasks. And so if you are able to leverage something like DOM diffs, instead what you're doing is you're telling anyone connected to this page, said that they're related to, or interested in these objects that you're now subscribed to. And when any of those objects change, I'm going to broadcast that there's a change. And what it will do is it just reloads the content of the page. It doesn't reload the page. It doesn't like go white and wait for the content to come back. It does it behind the scenes, right? Where you would do this if you made a single page application. And it brings that new content in and it swaps it in place and everything just works, right? Asterisks, obviously, right? None of this stuff is a silver bullet. But you can do DOM morphing in htmx as well, right? It's just a couple of different attributes and like a third-party library that you bring in. Okay. Where are we? 10:30. I'm almost there. I got like 2 slides left. So if we looked at something more complex, right, like a dashboard, you'd be like, well, I don't know about this. Here's where I start to lose you, John, right? I'd say, whoa, hold on. Like maybe there's some stuff we could salvage here, right? Like the search, right? I think if you started to type in a box, you're probably going to make a request to some page. Maybe it's a page dedicated to search results of, I don't know, a specific resource. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a generalized search, right? But it's going to take your query parameters. It's going to respond back. You could do a nice little like drop down of some autocomplete responses. And if they hit enter, you go to a different page, right? This is a great candidate for potentially doing HTML and passing it forward, right, to the response and swapping that stuff in when you need to. But it does get a little bit more complex, right? Maybe you have a calendar page that you could swap in when you're trying to show like a mini calendar on your dashboard, but oh man, these other things, I don't think that's gonna work. That's okay, right? Like that's completely fine. You can always leverage JavaScript. Do whatever you want to do. Use whatever libraries you want to use, right? But use them when you need them. Don't use them by default. Don't introduce the complexity ahead of time. Find the places where you need it, and then use it. It's completely fine. So, how do we do better? Again, I think we support this concept of shared knowledge. We start simple. We use technologies that support our goals. And I need you to question complexity when you see it, however that has to happen. And be an advocate for good old HTML. I love it. Love it. So a couple bonus complexities. We're almost there. Just in case, I'm not going to talk about this stuff, but like, again, if we're trying to target things that we could maybe get rid of, can you just write CSS instead of Sass? Like, CSS variables are amazing. You can do some awesome stuff out of the box, right? And if you don't know about that, then that's no fault of yours at all. Again, there's no like big CSS. Well, there are a couple CSS advocates, but I don't know. You'd have to be really interested in CSS to go chase that stuff. But it's there, right? There's all these cool new things that you can do. And you could potentially, asterisks, replace some of this complex build process stuff that you have with your JavaScript with something like unpackage that we looked at earlier. There's import maps, which is like a different way of specifying these JavaScript imports, being able to like abstract that out so you could still say something like require React or import React inside of your JavaScript code, but it actually maps back to a specific version, hash URL kind of thing, wherever you want to pull that content from. And this is just, if you can, please stop using UI libraries that are tied to a specific implementation of a JavaScript library. I don't think that helps us in the long term. So, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. We do have some time for some questions. And please check out clevelandgivecamp.org. Does anybody have a question? Yeah.
If you had to lay out the key differences between Hotwire and htmx, the major pros and cons,
Yep.
when to stay away, when to go towards.
I would say you would never use both. And I think the htmx, what it has going for it in unpoly, are that it is untethered to whatever you're doing on the back end. Right? So it's telling you to be explicit about the attributes that you add to your content so that it knows what to do with it. What kind of happens on the Hotwire Turbo side is that there's this JavaScript library that runs that sends different request headers and looks for different response headers and knows how to adapt that content. And so it works really well in Rails, where there's a server-side component, so that you can get all the niceties about how to render and handle those things. But somebody has to build the server-side component. And so one exists, I think, in the PHP in ecosystem. There's nothing that would stop anybody. It's not really complex stuff, but it is a thing that would need to exist in what you have or what you want to work with. And so I would say that if you're in Rails, you're going to use Hotwire Turbo. If you're not, you can use whatever looks good, but if you're going to go the turbo route, you're probably going to use something that exists, or you're going to be very passionate about that direction over somebody else's choice. Good question. Anybody else? Anybody have like a horror story? You don't have to say that because I think there's a recording and I don't want anybody to get canned. So, browser memory? We don't have to worry about that. Yeah, just upgrade your device. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. They're all good things. Like, that's the thing that kind of makes me mad. I'm working on a very, very JavaScript intensive project right now. It doesn't have to be like that, right? Like, React was made to diff DOM and to swap content in, and it does an amazing job at it. And then we, as an ecosystem, have said, yeah, but I also need, and I also need, and I also need, and maybe some of those projects need some of that extra stuff, but maybe they don't. And I think you should be very comfortable starting simple. Yeah.
So talk about React and Vue and the others. State management
Yep.
is a big thing. I'm curious what your ideas are on why we don't lean more on the browser side, like databases and things like that,
Leveraging local state.
to leverage local state instead of leaning on these libraries.
Well, I mean, I think you introduce complexity, right? And it's not, again, not a bad thing, but now you have the potential for your local state to be out of sync with your server state. Something needs to manage that. And I am sure there are hundreds of libraries that are there to help you through that if that's what you're looking for. But it does add some complexity, right?
I just see that there's not a lot of help when you're like, okay, I'm gonna connect to these because you got to do the web worker, service worker.
Yep. Yep. There's service workers. There's the different storage options that are in accepted or deprecated states across the browsers and stuff like that. There are a lot of like uniform options that you can leverage and stuff still. And it's definitely something that you can do, right? If you're trying to build a spa experience, if you're trying to build a single page application, it's not a bad thing to try to like do as much of that as you can, right? Because you're trying to like reduce response times, you're trying to make it feel snappy, you're trying to be proactive on the UI side, even though you could lag on the actual like server accepting the response and handling and processing the data, right? And so sometimes you have to step in to say like, I will fake it, I'll fake this before I make this kind of thing, right? But that's fine, you can do that with JavaScript on the SPA side as well. I think that's all we got. Thank you very much, everybody.